Lost in the wilderness. The forest was dark, cold, and filled with strange sounds. Tall trees stretched high, their thick branches blocking most of the sunlight. The ground was damp, covered in moss and fallen leaves. A small figure moved slowly between the trees, an alien woman, weak and exhausted. Her long, slender arms clutched a tiny child close to her chest, shielding the little one from the cold wind. Her name was Zyra, and she had nothing left except her child. Their ship had crashed 2 nights ago. The others had left her behind, taking whatever supplies they could carry. They had no room for a weak mother and her child. Zyra had begged them not to leave, but they ignored her. She was useless to them. Now, she walked alone through the wild, struggling to find food, water, and shelter. The child in her arms, Ryle, let out a small whimper. He was hungry, but Zyra had nothing to give him. She had eaten a few bitter berries earlier, but they made her stomach hurt. She knew she needed real food soon, or they wouldn't survive. As she walked, her eyes darted around, scanning for danger. This forest was unfamiliar. The air smelled strange, a mix of damp earth and something metallic. There were no signs of civilization, no paths, no lights, just endless trees and the feeling that something was watching them. A rustling sound came from the bushes nearby. Zyra froze. Her heart pounded as she held Ryle closer. Slowly, she turned her head. Glowing eyes stared at her from the darkness. A low growl rumbled through the air. A predator. Zyra's legs trembled, but she didn't run. Running would make her prey. Instead, she stepped back slowly, keeping her eyes locked on the creature. It was large, its shape barely visible in the shadows. Sharp claws scratched against a tree trunk, and its nostrils flared as it sniffed the air. It smelled her fear. Ryle whimpered again, and the creature reacted instantly. It lunged forward. Zyra spun around and ran. Her feet stumbled over roots and rocks, but she didn't stop. The beast crashed through the trees behind her, its heavy paws pounding against the ground. Zyra's breath came in sharp gasps, her muscles burning from exhaustion. She knew she couldn't outrun it. She had to hide. Up ahead, she saw a large fallen tree, its hollow trunk wide enough for her and Ryle to fit inside. With a final burst of energy, she dived inside, curling her body around Ryle to keep him quiet. She pressed her back against the rough wood, her breath shallow. The beast slowed down, sniffing the ground. It was searching for them. Zyra clenched her jaw. If it found them, she had no weapons, no strength to fight. All she could do was wait and hope it lost interest. Minutes passed. The beast prowled around the tree, growling softly. Then, after what felt like forever, it turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. Zyra didn't move. She waited, listening. Only when she was sure it was gone did she slowly crawl out of the hollow trunk. She was shaking. Her body ached, her head felt light, and her stomach twisted in hunger. But she couldn't stop now. She had to keep moving. As the sky darkened, the cold became worse. She needed shelter for the night. Further ahead, she spotted a small rocky overhang, enough to block the wind. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Carefully, she set Ryle down and wrapped him in her thin cloak. He shivered, but his eyes remained closed. She stroked his small face. "I won't let anything happen to you," she whispered. Then she heard it again. A sound. But this time, it wasn't an animal. It was footsteps. Zyra's heart skipped a beat. She pressed herself against the rocks, peering through the darkness. A figure moved between the trees, tall and strong. The silhouette carried something long and metallic, a weapon. Her body tensed. Was it one of the aliens who abandoned her? Or something worse? Then the figure stepped into the moonlight. A human. Zyra had never seen one before, only heard stories. Some said humans were ruthless hunters, dangerous and aggressive. Others said they were survivors, people who could endure any hardship. She didn't know which one this was. But he was getting closer. Zara's breath caught in her throat. If he found them, would he kill them? Or was there a chance he would help? She had no choice but to wait and find out. A desperate fight for survival. The wind howled through the trees, rustling the leaves in a ghostly whisper. Zara crouched against the rocky overhang, barely breathing. Her alien heart pounded in her chest as she clutched Ryle close, shielding him from the cold night. The human was coming closer. His footsteps were slow but steady, moving with the ease of a predator who knew he was the most dangerous thing in the forest. The faint glow of moonlight revealed his silhouette, a tall, broad figure wrapped in dark clothing, a long rifle resting against his shoulder. His face remained hidden in the shadows. Zara pressed her back harder against the rock. What did humans do to creatures like her? Were the stories true? That they hunted anything weaker than them? That they took trophies, wearing the bones of their kills? She had no choice but to stay silent and invisible. Ryle shifted in her arms, his tiny fingers curling into her cloak. A soft whimper escaped his lips. Zara's blood turned to ice. The human stopped walking. His head tilted slightly, his ears catching the sound. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then he took a step forward, then another. He was coming straight for them. Zara's breathing became shallow. Think. Think. Her fingers curled around the only weapon she had, a sharp, jagged stone. It was nothing against a rifle, but she wouldn't die without a fight. The human took another step. He was only a few paces away now. Zara's muscles tensed. She had to strike first. She had to. A deep growl rumbled through the darkness. Zara's blood ran cold. That sound wasn't human. The human hunter froze, his grip tightening on his rifle. Then, from the thick shadows of the forest, the predator returned. It was bigger than before, its glowing yellow eyes locked onto them. Lips curled back to reveal rows of jagged teeth dripping with saliva. The beast had tracked her here. She had thought she had escaped, but she was wrong. It wanted its meal. The human lifted his rifle in a fluid motion, aiming straight at the monster's head. The beast let out a thunderous roar in charge. The human fired. A deafening crack split the air. The bullet struck the predator's shoulder, but it wasn't enough. The creature barely stumbled before leaping straight at the hunter. Zara watched, eyes wide with shock. The human didn't run. He stood his ground. As the monster lunged, he sidestepped with inhuman speed, twisting his rifle around and slamming the butt of the weapon into the creature's skull. The beast snarled, swinging its massive claws, but the human ducked, rolling backward into a perfect counterattack. He wasn't just a hunter. He was a warrior. Zara had never seen anyone move like that. Fast, efficient, every action precise and deadly. The beast lunged again, and the human pulled out a long curved blade from his belt. The fight turned brutal. The predator swiped at the human, missing by inches. The man twisted, slashing deep into its flesh. Dark blood sprayed across the dirt. The creature roared in agony, but didn't stop. Zara held her breath, heart racing. If the human lost, they were all dead. Then, in a blur of motion, the human dropped to one knee, sliding beneath the beast's final attack. As the monster came down, he thrust his blade upward, driving it deep into the creature's throat. The beast choked, gurgled, then collapsed. The forest fell silent. Zara didn't realize she was trembling. The human pulled his knife free, breathing heavily, then wiped the blade on his sleeve. He glanced at the lifeless predator, then slowly turned toward Zara. Their eyes met. For the first time, Zara saw his face. He was young, but his sharp features were hardened by survival. His piercing blue eyes studied her, but there was no cruelty in them, only curiosity. He took a cautious step forward. Zara tensed, still gripping her sharp stone. She knew she had no chance if he decided to attack. Instead, the human slowly lowered his weapon. Zara's breath caught in her throat. He wasn't trying to kill her. He was trying to help. And for the first time since she was abandoned, she wasn't sure if she should be afraid. The mysterious human hunter. Zyra's grip on the jagged stone tightened. Her body trembled, not from the cold, but from uncertainty. The predator lay lifeless on the forest floor, its thick, black blood seeping into the dirt. The human had killed it with terrifying skill. But now he stood only a few steps away from her, his piercing blue eyes locked onto hers. He hadn't attacked. He hadn't spoken. He just watched. The fire in the hunter's gaze made Zyra's instincts scream. He is the real predator here. Ryle stirred in her arms. A small, weak whimper escaped his lips. The human's expression changed. The sharp intensity in his eyes softened as he looked down at the child. He let out a slow breath, and in a move that caught Zyra completely off guard, he crouched down. Zyra stiffened. He was making himself smaller. It wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign that he wasn't a threat. She didn't move. She barely breathed. The human reached into a small pack on his belt. Zyra's muscles tensed. Was it a weapon? A trap? Then he pulled out a small package wrapped in thin metallic foil. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing food. Zyra's stomach twisted painfully at the sight. It was dried meat cut into neat strips. The scent of rich, salty protein hit her senses like a shockwave. Her body craved it. The human didn't offer it to her right away. He broke off a small piece and placed it on a flat stone between them. Then he leaned back slightly, watching her reaction. A test. Zyra hesitated. This could be a trick. But her starving body betrayed her. Slowly, she reached out, snatching the piece of meat and pulling it close. She sniffed it cautiously, expecting poison or something dangerous. But it was just food. Hunger won over fear. She placed it in her mouth, chewing slowly. The taste was unlike anything she had ever eaten. Dense, chewy, filled with energy. It was real food. Zyra swallowed, and for the first time in days, she felt strength returning to her body. The human remained quiet, watching her carefully. He didn't speak, didn't move suddenly. He just let her decide for herself. Zyra realized something. If he wanted to kill her, he would have done it already. If he wanted to take her child, he could have. But he hadn't. She looked down at Ryle. His small, fragile hands curled into her cloak. His skin was too cold, too pale. He wouldn't last another night without real warmth, real food. The human stood up and took a slow step backward. He motioned with his head, then turned, walking away. He wasn't forcing her to follow, but he was giving her a choice. Zyra stared at his retreating form. Her mind screamed at her to stay hidden, to stay alone. But her heart, her instincts as a mother, told her that this human was their only chance. She took a shaky breath. Then, clutching Ryle tightly to her chest, she followed. The human's camp. Zyra followed the human, her steps light, cautious. The forest stretched endlessly around them, dark and silent, except for the occasional rustling of unseen creatures. Ryle remained curled in her arms, his breathing shallow but steady. The human didn't speak. He moved through the trees like he belonged to the wild, his steps careful, deliberate. He knew every branch that might snap underfoot, every shadow that could hide a predator. Zyra had spent days lost in this place. Yet in just minutes, he navigated the terrain with confidence. She watched him closely, studying his movements. This was no ordinary hunter. He wasn't just surviving. He was thriving. Zyra's people had always whispered about humans. They were unpredictable, dangerous, impossible to control. Some said humans could be ruthless killers. Others believed they were the only species in the galaxy too stubborn to die. So why was this one helping her? Her instincts screamed at her to be careful, to run. But where? There was no safety in this wilderness. And Ryle was growing weaker. Ahead, the human suddenly raised a hand, signaling her to stop. Zyra froze instantly. He listened for a moment. then motioned for her to stay low. Something was nearby. Zyra's grip on Rydell tightened. Her eyes scanned the trees, searching for movement. But the human had already spotted the threat. His hand moved to his belt, fingers curling around a small, sleek weapon, not his rifle, but a blade. A predator. More raiders. Zyra braced herself. Then, without a sound, the human disappeared into the shadows. Zyra's breath hitched. He moved like a ghost. One moment he was there, the next, gone. She waited. Every second stretched painfully long. Then, a sharp snap echoed through the trees. A rustling. A strangled yelp. Silence. Moments later, the human emerged from the darkness, dragging the limp body of a small four-legged animal. Its throat had been cut cleanly. A kill. Zyra stared at him, wide-eyed. She hadn't even seen him attack. The human gave her a brief glance, then slung the animal over his shoulder. Without a word, he continued walking. Zyra hesitated. She could turn back now. She could disappear before he led her into a trap. But then she looked at Rydell. His little face was too pale, too cold. His small breaths were weak. He needed food. He needed warmth. Zyra swallowed her fear and kept walking. A place of shelter. They reached the human's camp just as the first hints of dawn touched the sky. It wasn't what Zyra expected. She had imagined a rough shelter, maybe a cave or a pile of sticks, thrown together in a desperate attempt to stay dry. But this was different. The human had built a fortified outpost, hidden between a cluster of thick trees and large rocks. A natural barricade. The entrance was well concealed, surrounded by a wall of sharpened wooden stakes, their tips darkened, burned for hardness. Inside, there was a simple but functional shelter, built from salvaged metal and fabric. A fire pit sat in the center, still warm from the last use. This wasn't just a camp. This was a survivor's stronghold. Zyra took a slow step inside, her senses on high alert. The human moved ahead, setting the dead animal down near the fire pit. He knelt, pulling out a knife, and began cleaning his kill with practiced efficiency. Zyra watched, unsure what to do. She had never seen this process up close before. Her people never hunted. They took what they needed from their ships, their machines. They didn't live like this. The human, however, didn't waste a single motion. He skinned the creature swiftly, cutting clean portions of meat while discarding unnecessary parts. And then, he did something unexpected. He pulled out a small metal container and poured its contents over the meat, seasoning. Zyra's stomach twisted. He wasn't just eating to survive. He still cared about taste. It was such a simple thing, but it meant something. The human set the meat over the fire, cooking it carefully. The smell filled the air, rich, smoky, warm. Zyra's mouth watered. He glanced at her again. Then, as before, he didn't offer the food. Instead, he placed a piece on a nearby rock, letting her choose. Zyra hesitated for only a second before picking it up. The first bite was a shock. Hot, full of flavor. It was the best thing she had eaten in days. The human didn't react. He just kept cooking, as if this was normal. As if sharing his food was simply what humans did. Zyra looked at Rydell. The child had barely moved, but she could tell. He needed warmth. She swallowed her pride. "Can I?" Her voice was hoarse from disuse. She hesitated, then pointed to the fire. "Him." The human blinked. Then, with a small nod, he gestured for her to come closer. Zyra hesitated once more. Then, carefully, she stepped forward and knelt beside the fire, wrapping Rydell tightly in her arms. The warmth seeped into her skin, and for the first time in days, she let out a slow, shuddering breath. She wasn't safe. She didn't trust him. But for this moment, this single moment, she wasn't alone. Learning to trust. The night stretched long and silent. The crackling fire cast flickering shadows against the rough walls of the shelter. Zyra sat with Rydell curled against her chest, her back pressed against the cool metal of the human's makeshift fortress. She wasn't asleep. She couldn't sleep. Every instinct screamed at her that this was dangerous. Staying here, lowering her guard. The human had been nothing but calm and controlled, but that didn't mean he wasn't a threat. She stole a glance at him. He sat across the fire, sharpening his knife. His movements were slow, careful. The light caught the sharp edge of the blade as he worked, scraping the metal with practiced precision. A weapon. A reminder. Zira shifted slightly, tightening her hold on Ryle. Her child slept deeply now, finally warm, finally full. That alone was the reason she was still here. She could have left. She should have left. And yet, she didn't. Not yet. The human suddenly stopped sharpening his knife. His gaze lifted, locking onto her. Zira went still. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he reached into his pack. Zira's muscles tensed, ready to react, ready to fight. But instead of pulling out a weapon, he withdrew something small and round. He tossed it across the fire toward her. Zira caught it purely on reflex. It was a fruit. She blinked, staring at it in confusion. The human gestured toward the fruit, then made a slow motion toward his mouth. Eat. Zira's stomach clenched. Was this another test? Another trick? She hesitated. Then slowly she raised the fruit to her lips and took a small bite. The taste was unlike anything she had ever eaten before. Sweet, tangy, bursting with life. She swallowed. The human gave a small nod, satisfied, and returned to sharpening his blade. Zira frowned. That was it. No words, no questions, no demands. Humans were supposed to be loud, forceful, arrogant. But this one, he was quiet. Too quiet. And that was almost more unsettling. A lesson in survival. The next morning, Zira woke to the smell of cooking meat. Ryle stirred in her arms, letting out a soft, sleepy sound. She blinked against the early morning light, her body aching from exhaustion. Across the camp, the human was already moving. He had skinned and cooked another fresh kill, preparing portions with careful efficiency. His rifle was slung across his back, his knife strapped to his side. Always armed, always ready. Zira sat up slowly. The human didn't acknowledge her immediately, but he did something that surprised her again. He placed a small, sharpened knife on the rock beside her. Then, without a word, he turned and began breaking down a small section of his shelter, reinforcing a weak spot. Zira frowned at the blade. She understood the message immediately. He was giving her a weapon, a choice, a sign of trust. She hesitated, staring at the blade. He wasn't treating her like a prisoner. He wasn't treating her like an outsider. He was treating her like a survivor. Zira picked up the knife, testing its weight in her hand. The human didn't react. He simply continued working, as if he already knew she wouldn't use it against him. She exhaled slowly. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't an enemy. A different kind of strength. The day passed in strange silence. Zira watched the human closely, studying his movements. He didn't waste energy. He knew exactly what to do and when to do it. He set traps, checked supplies, kept his weapons in perfect condition. She found herself memorizing his actions. At one point, he disappeared into the trees. Zira tensed immediately, gripping the knife he had given her. Was this it? Was he finally betraying her? Then, a low, mechanical click. Zira turned her head sharply. The human had crouched near a cluster of thick vines, carefully pulling something from the dirt. A trap. And inside it, a small, struggling creature. Zira watched, her curiosity overpowering her suspicion. He had placed these traps earlier. He had known exactly where to check. Hunting without wasting bullets. Efficient. The human made quick work of the creature, then glanced back at her, as if expecting something. Zira hesitated. Then, gripping her knife tightly, she stepped forward. The human tilted his head slightly but said nothing. He simply handed her another piece of vine, gesturing toward the next trap. Another test. Zira swallowed. She crouched beside the trap, copying his movements, her hands slightly shaky but determined. She had never hunted like this before, never been forced to. But today, she learned. The human watched, offering no words, no praise, only a single nod of approval. For the first time, Zira felt something shift inside her. Maybe she wasn't just taking his help anymore. Maybe, just maybe, she was becoming a survivor too. The final threat. The night air was thick with tension. Zira had learned to recognize the signs. The way the forest fell silent, how even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Something was coming. She could feel it in her bones. The human felt it too. He stood near the fire, his rifle already slung across his back, his knife secured at his hip. His sharp blue eyes scanned the trees, his body tense but controlled. He had sensed the shift long before Zira had. Zira gripped the small knife he had given her. Her fingers tightened around the handle, but she knew, if something attacked, she wouldn't stand a chance. Ryle stirred in his sleep. Zira instinctively placed a protective hand over him, her heart pounding. Then, a distant hum. Zira's entire body went rigid. That sound. She knew that sound. The human turned his head slightly, listening. The hum grew louder, a deep mechanical whine cutting through the silence. A ship. Not a large one, but fast, circling the sky above the trees like a predator searching for prey. Zira's stomach twisted. She recognized that design. Her people had returned, not to rescue her, to finish what they started. Nowhere to run. The human moved instantly. He strode toward his pack, grabbing extra ammo and a second blade. His movements were precise, calm but fast. He wasn't panicking. He was preparing for war. Zira stayed frozen for a moment, her breath shallow. Her people had left her here to die. Why would they come back now? Then the ship's engine shifted. The sound grew closer. Zira snapped into motion. She rushed to Ryle, lifting him into her arms as the human suddenly grabbed her wrist. She flinched, but his grip wasn't aggressive. His eyes locked onto hers. Firm, serious. He made a simple gesture. Stay. She wanted to argue, to demand answers, but before she could, a burst of blue light tore through the sky. A plasma shot. It hit the ground near the camp, sending up an explosion of dirt and fire. The force threw Zira backward, making her ears ring. Ryle screamed. Through the smoke and chaos, she saw them, figures emerging from the trees. They were heavily armored, and walking straight toward the camp. Her people. But these weren't just scouts. These were hunters. And they had one mission. Erase the loose ends. The human fights back. The human moved before Zira could even process what was happening. He dived into a roll, grabbing his rifle in one smooth motion. He hit the ground, aimed, and fired. The first shot hit the nearest alien square in the chest. The force sent the attacker sprawling, his armor cracking under the impact. The second shot tore through the leg of another. A scream of pain filled the air. Zira could only watch in shock. He wasn't just fighting. He was winning. Her people had superior technology, armor, plasma weapons, shields. But the human had instincts. He didn't just shoot. He moved like a predator. He used the trees, the smoke, the fire. He was unpredictable, relentless. For the first time in her life, Zira witnessed something terrifying. Humans weren't just survivors. They were warriors. Zira's choice. The remaining attackers regrouped, taking defensive positions. One of them lifted a communicator to his mouth. "They're calling for backup," Zira whispered, her voice tight. The human reloaded his weapon. His face remained unreadable, but she could see the calculation in his eyes. He could run. He could leave her and the child behind. This wasn't his fight. But then, he looked at Ryle. For the briefest moment, His hardened expression shifted. Then, without hesitation, he grabbed a spare weapon from his pack and threw it to Zira. Her fingers closed around it instinctively. A gun. Her breath hitched. He wasn't just protecting her anymore. He was expecting her to fight. The thought sent a jolt through her system. Zira had never been a warrior. She had been cast aside, abandoned, treated as weak. But now, a human, a species feared across the stars, had put a weapon in her hands. He saw more in her than her own people ever had. She clenched her jaw. No more running. The next time the plasma bolts came flying, Zira lifted the gun and fired back.